Welcome, everyone, to today's episode. We have a quite controversial topic today. We will take a closer look at the manifesto of the infamous Unabomber. And the ones that are a bit older among you might remember his attacks in the, I believe, 90s, right? 95, if I remember correctly. And the years before, he committed many attacks. And um, yeah, Alex and me, we both read the manifesto, and the reason for it was that he makes a couple of bold but intelligent claims, and I feel he makes more original, bold, new intelligent claims than you would get from the average academic text you read.
And
So, yes,
interestingly,
Alex.
like for me, I just read it for the first time a few days ago, and it seems like you have some history with this manifesto. I'm also curious, like what brought your attention to it, and what's kind of your history with it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have much more history in a sense. The original reason was me talking with friends about AI technology
Mm,
acceleration. And we're brainstorming or thinking about what effects does that have on society and where does that go. The Unabomber Manifesto was mentioned, I think, twice in different contexts. Besides consequences, he draws being insanely misanthropic. His thoughts on this and his framework gives an interesting perspective on those developments. And while reading it, I was so surprised how dense it is with many unconventional views on the subject. If there's intelligent new views on the subject, I think it's usually interesting to consider. And the claims he makes fit interestingly into the podcast topics. So we both talked about the psychology of the left, topic he discusses. Also for him, autonomy and freedom is pretty central. And there's a third element of technological developments, but also what that means for society. So his view on technology is not mainly technical, but more sociological or societal, what consequences it has for freedom
mhm.
and autonomy and societies. Would suggest we split the discussion in like 5 topics. We already started with the introduction. Why is this interesting? Then I think it might be interesting to shortly address why reading such a text of a terrorist who justifies his fanatism might be interesting. Some people might be worried to kind of go down a rabbit hole, just turn out as fanatic or be convinced
Mm.
by that. Then I would suggest we maybe talk about the core argument briefly, what we think, and then about some practical consequences. I asked Claude to summarize it and also to add some um, references or make suggestions of the intellectual heritage the text builds upon, because the author mentions very few references. He doesn't see himself as an academic text, so I guess that is to be expected, but it's maybe interesting to also have a look at.
And also, when I was reading, what was definitely clear for me is that there are certain things that are familiar for me. So, like basically, he, in a way, talking about this power processes, is describing what is neurotic behavior and the surrogate tasks or surrogate activities that he talks about. It's kind of like a quite a common topic, maybe explored not necessarily with these words, but in a different literature as well. So, in a way, it was interesting to see ideas which are familiar to me, but also the way he talks about them, but also the conclusions that he makes are very different from what I would assume can be done as a conclusion from the same kind of observations.
I asked AI to draw parallels to other known thinkers, and I guess some of them are familiar to you, and that's presumably where you read this or recognize this familiarity. And it's um, Erich Fromm
Hmm.
with Escape
Yeah,
from Freedom and Surrogate
yeah, for sure.
Activities, which I guess is closest to what you say. Herbert Marcuse. Do you say Marcuse?
I don't know.
One-dimensional man and repressive desublimation. Apparently, strong parallels there. Jacques Ellul, the Technological Society. Does that ring a bell
Not
for
really.
you? And Louis Mumford. Those are apparently quite obvious parallels of implicit sources that are not cited in the text. And that's very interesting to keep in mind. Erich Fromm is, I guess, the most famous, or at least well known to you. Oh, presume, yeah. So maybe interesting to draw some parallels and maybe critically keep that in mind while talking about the text. To make people read it, the Unabomber threatened to kill people if big newspapers wouldn't publish his manifesto. And the big newspapers did.
And there's one thing which draw my attention. In the
Yeah.
manifesto itself, he mentioned that if I wouldn't do that, I would not have a chance to have that kind of publicity, which is kind of a weird
Yes.
assumption because like a lot of people promote different kind of ideas, and it's not necessarily necessary to be
Yeah.
counter. So at least there's a very limiting assumption
Yeah.
that he makes, which also undermines where else he comes from such a limiting kind of mindset.
Of course, it's not necessarily the only way to get that attention, but to get that broad
Mhm,
attention, especially in a short period of time, it is a quite effective way. You can at least say that the path he took, independently of what you think about it
mhm.
morally, at least worked to make that quite popular in the 90s. Well, I was too young back then. It presumably was a big thing in the 90s, also as it was published in the newspapers. On the other hand, I guess people, because of knowing who wrote it, have the wish or drive to, in a way, psychologically protect themselves to overclick quickly, delegitimize the claims in the document. Like, let's say, the intellectual honesty and curiosity a lot. And I think even when you would go with most of the claims in the document, first you'd never have to draw those inferences. Um, and and I guess that's something where we can come back to later, because especially the last part with phonetic consequences, even with factually things he says, you could say, well, I still don't want to, for example, accept the starvation of millions and maybe even billions of people in this transformation that he lays out. And so there's value judgments in there, right? And also, of course, you could say, even like if I completely aligned with him, um, and if everything would be true, um, then, well, if I would realize everything to be true, then I should, in a way, still follow in the footsteps, right? And if that was true, like kind of closing the eyes before reality also wouldn't be the good way to go. But I guess I don't have the worry that just by reading something, I would suddenly think it's a good idea to kill billions of people in a process of doing anything. And I think that's also the reason why he is not so much discussed. There's this fear. This is dangerous thought. I don't even want to look at it. What if it makes me fanatic?
You know,
Anything to
I
add?
didn't have
Any?
an impression like
Yeah,
this because it's clearly written, but also he makes sweeping generalizations, although often he acknowledges that and says that, but it doesn't distort the main point, even though I'm generalizing. But I think for me, it was not as persuasive, or at least it was not as scary that I would assume that,
yeah,
well, I need to do something about it, or I'm persuaded to believe in what he says and in his conclusions. So it was a point of view.
yeah.
Obviously, there is a reason to believe in a rationale like this, and I think a lot of people right now have the similar kind of reservations in terms of what is going to happen with AI, and AI ethicists and people like this, they're thinking about like what's going to be with the future of humanity. And I think there are quite reasonable concerns there. But also reading the manifesto itself, it's not dangerous. So it's just like a set of words and set of ideas which are also not that scary, even though some of them are quite interesting.
I would say in the first part, ideas are more interesting to at least look at, and he also provides frameworks of thinking about certain things with
Mhm.
making distinctions. Yeah, I would suggest we dive right in. The HTML document that Claude gave me is actually a good starting point. So I would suggest we maybe go through there section by section. The manifesto presents itself as a serious sociological and psychological argument for the complete abolition of industrial technological civilization. It is organized into thematic sections running from psychological critique of the political left through a detailed theory of human motivation to a revolutionary strategy. The core thesis. The Industrial Revolution is described as a catastrophe for humanity. The text argues that the industrial technological system either survives or collapses, and that both outcomes are bad. If it survives, it will eventually eliminate human autonomy and dignity entirely. If it collapses, the transition will be violent and chaotic. The earlier it collapses, the less catastrophic the consequences. Therefore, Freedom Club, that's pretty much him, advocates active revolution to destroy the industrial technological system's economic and technological foundations, not merely its governments. The manifesto explicitly distinguishes itself from political revolution. Its target is not any particular government or ideology, but technology and industrial organization as such, which it treats as ideologically neutral forces that override all political systems. So, pretty much in my own words, briefly, the core thesis is we have this technological industrial complex system, and it further and further eliminates our autonomy and dignity. Yeah. And as further it develops, the worse the consequences are to reverse the structure, reverse the project process of technological industrial evolution or um, development. And so the earlier we stop it, the less catastrophic the consequences to going back is.
Yeah.
What do you think
Well,
about this?
I'm not buying I'm not buying it, or at least it's really difficult for me to buy it fully, because obviously there is a degree of alienation that people experience in today's world, and often
Yeah,
that is contrasted with a kind of glory past where people were smiling to each other, living in small communities, and everything was
yeah,
fine, which is just a way
yes,
to pick up the facts and construct one narrative. It's possible to construct a very different narrative of life, of misery, starvation, death, and everything in between. So
yeah.
I think in a way he glorifies this primitive way of living, which doesn't make sense, because it's not like people were that much happy. Obviously, there were engaged in meaningful activities, but meaningful activities were about basically basic subsistence, like how to find food, how to build a shelter, and producing the very, very basic needs.
I think it's a good point what you mentioned. So one thing you can question is, well, was that untechnological time where he talks, for example, about the old American frontier, was it really so good? To like to considerately read the text in the thesis, I think it's good to not like talk about higher death rates, because that's not what it is about for him, right? He would say, if you have like kind of a happy and content life, the idea is like you go out on the field and you're just satisfied in the evening, right? You have like torment yourself, effort, and you're happy. And I guess that's something we can maybe further discuss once we talked about the power process. Another thing that's to be questioned is, well, it, it could be a false dilemma, right? So, do you really just have those two extreme options? So, for example, no middle path we can take. Then another thing is, of course, well, which is presumably quite plausible, though, if you want to go back and the technological development progresses and technology is deeper and deeper integrated into society, whether it is really true that it's harder to go back to the first state.
And I
I
think
think the yeah,
I think that there's also, to what you said, what is related is that it's as if the human being becomes very passive and has no agency and no way to make decisions. It's almost like a human being is a passive vessel into which technology can add whatever is happening. So like as if that there is no choice. I think exactly that's not necessarily only two possible alternatives.
but I think he says something quite convincing about that point later on. Vaguely, it's there is people who would fight for freedom and so on, but there's a higher incentive or um, a temptation to use technology for greater comfort, or it's something positive to explore, while freedom is this abstract idea. That there's also like a control drive, right? To manipulate.
Yeah.
control other people. And that's something we see with the ideologies too, right? In the 20th century, that with greater means to control masses, it is used at least by a minority of clever sociopaths.
And I think also like there is a it's mentioned in the passing, but I think it's again illustrative in terms of the kind of mindset that he has, because somewhere, because it's still kind of fresh reading of it, he mentioned like there is no possibility to have more small businesses for people, which is kind of ridiculous. And we know that the internet, for example,
Yeah.
created a lot of opportunities also for people in the third world to have
Yeah.
much more affluent life, because it creates so many new niches for serving others and delivering values basically in this meta virtual world. So I think he also has this kind of a like a zero sum game view on the world.
Yeah, I think you're playing on the idea later, and maybe we should continue in laying out the text so the reader can follow. But to that, maybe a small background here, because you mentioned it. He distinguishes technology that is requires big organization, and from technology that's somewhat independent or just needs small ecosystems to run. For example, mill in the Middle Ages just needed maybe a family, maybe the village at most, to sustain the technology, while you could say the internet even today needs big power plants, needs a lot of infrastructure. It's of course to be debated, right? But that would be one example. You can of course reasonably ask here, isn't he just cherry picking? Gives the example the car automobile, right? Developments. So in the beginning, it gave freedom to people. People could travel further, was more comfortable. So it seemed to be a good thing, give autonomy and then later, when it was adopted systematically, you needed for coordination all those rules. You needed a lot of infrastructure. You needed to restructure cities. It also led to working rhythm that was way more, he would say, fitted to the technological needs, kind of unintended consequences. But because we didn't want to give up the luxury or the benefits of the automobile, we got ourselves in that situation, entrenched into a system that maybe serves more upholding the system than overall us. It's unintended choices that get us in a one-way street, a dead end, and we just end up there and we're like, okay, how did we end up there? We made all those small choices to maintain using a certain technology, but wouldn't buy the whole package. I guess that's kind of his idea. No, and what you're saying is, well, that is one example, might be true here. We don't know, but there's many examples and maybe also developments now that maybe with new technologies make us less organization dependent. And there can be new technologies that actually don't need bigger industries and organizations, state structures to sustain itself. Some of those technologies might bring us back to just requiring a village to maintain the conditions to use that technology, right?
I mean, it could be one scenario that he didn't at least acknowledge.
Yeah. Shall we maybe continue a bit? I guess it's because that was just the core thesis, so we
Mm.
can discuss point by point. The next one would be the psychology of the left. The manifesto opens not with its revolutionary program, but with an extended attack on left wing ideology and psychology. Kaczynski, that's the guy, identifies two psychological tendencies in modern leftists: feelings of inferiority and over socialization. Feelings of inferiority are defined broadly to include low self esteem, depression, guilt, and self hatred. The text argues that leftists are hypersensitive to perceived slights, hate strength and success, and are fundamentally motivated not by compassion or principle, but by hostility and frustrated power drives. Leftist art is said to reflect misery, defeat, and despair, and leftist philosophy is characterized as an emotional attack on reason and objective reality, driven by resentment of categories that assign superior and inferior. Over socialization describes people to deeply conditioned by society's moral norms that they suffer psychologically from the weight of these norms. The over socialized leftist, the text argues, rebels symbolically while remaining fundamentally loyal to the dominant system's core values, demanding that minorities be integrated into the professional class, not liberation from it. Yeah, I guess there's quite a bit to unpack here.
And I think the important caveat that he mentions is that he cannot define what exactly he means by modern leftism. So he uses an umbrella term for certain things without providing clear definition. And I think it's more like the other way around. So he describes certain things and then he probably picks the name which is kind of the closest that he can. Because another thing
Yeah.
that he mentions in several places, not all people on the left are like this. So
Yes.
he makes more of a generalization rather than saying that all people who are socialists or on the left necessarily subject to those kind of points that he makes.
But you could say there's a big overlap, or you would say the general new leftist movement plays on those categories psychologically. And there might also of course, be people that fall into this type without being or proclaiming themselves as leftists, right? So yeah, he describes more psychological type, and it kind of interestingly has some resemblances with my latest article I published. I don't know if you had a look at it, where I draw a parallel between the new left and the Puritanian roots of original sin, right? Like the certain redemption idea, inferiority, the last shall be first, and all those things. And that they self proclaimed heritage to the hippies, but betrayed the original ideas in a way. But they kind of, in a way, replayed the old patterns of their parents or grandparents, just under a more modern mask. And I guess that's something that would go in a direction what he mentions here, that they're pretty much not wanting to change anything. They're like over socialized, want to be Puritan, right? Even though they don't mention it, they want to be 150% the pure form and comply to the old society scripts, but want to make it even better, perfect in a way.
Yeah, and in this part, I notice a lot of parallels in work of Rollo May, who was an existential
Yeah.
psychologist, and one of his works, the book is called Power and Innocence. And in a way, he talks
Okay.
about similar things. He wrote a book called Power and Innocence, and the main idea is that some people cannot accept the power in themselves, and they assume this state of innocence as if I'm not doing any harm to others. But by doing this, they basically subdue all of their drives,
Yeah.
and there suppressed is the power and is the violence. And basically, I think it's very similar to what Kaczynski talks about here, is that people are trying to pretend that they are nice and do all the good things, stand for all the good things in the world and against all the bad things in the world. And
Yeah.
in a way that distorts the nature of man, distorts the needs of man, where they cannot fulfill what is part of their nature, the natural goals and strivings, but in a way they replace them with some artificial ones, like some social causes which are not necessarily needed, but more like, but that kind of gets us to the next section.
That refers to feelings of inferiority a lot too, right? I mean, it is something I observed is that people need a reason to, for example, proclaim that they are telling the truth, right? So if someone says, "Look, I'm telling the truth," I think there's usually two reasons why people do that, right? One is, well, other people are lying so much that they need to point out that they are telling the truth. But another one that's happens way more often is that they are not sure if they're telling the truth, or they want to convince you that they're telling the truth, and that's usually do that when they lie. So someone who needs to reiterate something the whole time and point out that they are the good person usually don't really believe that they're the good person or doubt it. Right, so I feel there's a certain inferiority complex that tries to compensate their inferiority often by overstating what they're doubting about themselves. Would would you agree?
Yeah, in some way, maybe I would express it slightly different, but in a way, yeah. So whenever there's a feeling of powerlessness, there is this urge to merge oneself with something which seems like a powerful organization or a powerful idea, a powerful ideology, or powerful cause. That way, as if I'm drawing my meaning to exist and my power and my agency from something bigger than myself. But then I'm losing myself as an individual. And obviously, typically it has some bad consequences because we need to draw from this well all the time because like we don't have our own fulfillment. Basically, we need to draw it from some external idea, which makes the very artificial process.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are 2 points that, fit well a broad class of leftists. And I think in this sense, his claim that this is generalization and it tries to draw influential big patterns is a good point, right? It- if it's 95 or 90 or 85%, or the loudest voices that define a certain culture, those two aspects seem to be pretty prevalent
Yeah.
in what you see mostly pushed by the new left. And of course, there's also, especially in its ideological like twin, the extreme right version,
Mm,
have, of course, also similar patterns. I mean, when I'm looking at the Nazis, I would also see a lot of similar patterns. So it's not really about the left as like necessary about the left, but currently it's those people who call themselves the new left or the left are those people for whom to whom the description
yeah. Yeah.
matches.
Yeah. And that's exactly Eric Fromm's analysis of how the Nazi authoritarian character works. His main idea is that people are drawn to those ideas as a replacement, as a way to escape from their own freedom.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting how well those psychological patterns, like the relabeling, worked out. As Mises already mentioned a couple of times he's saying after what happened, the people who have same inferiority complexes and those psychological patterns will label themselves completely opposite. Not saying they are the Nazis, but the new authoritarians, right? The new that people that need moral superiority to fight their inferiority complexes and not aware that this comes from an over socializations will frame themselves as opposite to that because that's actually what they need to fulfill the psychological drive.
Yeah. But also, what's important to add here is that the cause that people like this will choose is not necessarily discredited by itself. So they could stand for something which is basically a good, I mean, in my point of view, cause as well. Like if they're fighting racism, for example, that could be a really good cause to fight, but it could be that the if their intention is not there. So they are not fighting it because they stay against it on a principled stance, but it's more just like something that they need to do and they just choose
Well,
this
I think more
particular cause.
more there is also the need to, in those cases, I would say it's not the lack of principle, it's more the lack of compassion. And I think the lack of compassion, and that's what that's really confusing about the left, new left,
Mm,
at least, because they have those inferiority complex and this over socialization. They always need to proclaim they're like compassionate, but pretty much as if you always need to proclaim truth to pretty much, I don't know, disperse the fear, fight the fear that they might not be as compassionate. But because they have those complex and problems, they are also so self absorbed with their problems that they actually don't have much room for compassion. And they think in those, abstract societal terms,
hmm,
which is also an enemy of compassion. So like by introducing ideology, I feel no matter which one, you usually lose touch for humans. Then you're like thinking of ideas of class conflict, and then someone is just a placeholder for oppressed class or something,
mm,
and you don't see them as the human being. They're like a figure in your inferiority, superiority moral game.
yeah, it's a good point. And I think one manifestation of this is how some people on the left treat Iranian
Like,
protesters. Because basically they refuse to acknowledge their point of view, their agency.
yeah, they're more like ideological chess figures
Yes.
in the game. Um, yeah, and even when talking about racism or Black Lives Matter, it was always this big ideological fight, but it never matters. How does this actual mom of 3 children in Oklahoma feel about anything? That's not discussed. And yeah, okay. Do we want to go back to the text and continue. In the summary, I still have 4 sections. So the next one would be the power process, which we already briefly mentioned. This is the conceptual heart of the manifesto. The power process consists of 4 elements: goal, effort, attainment of the goal, and for most people, autonomy. Humans have a biologically rooted need to pursue meaningful goals through genuine effort under their own direction. When this process is frustrated, the predictable consequences are depression, aimlessness, hostility, addiction, disordered eating, and self harm. And he more broadly mentions escalating, never satisfied hedonism, right? Or certain forms of further and further sexual perversion. Industrial society disrupts the power process in 3 key ways. Physical needs are satisfied with minimal effort, removing meaningful natural goals. Artificial needs are manufactured by advertising to create new goals, but these are fundamentally unsatisfying surrogate activities. Third, most people must pursue all goals, including even surrogate ones, within systems that deny personal autonomy, which is the one which is more evolving as an industrial technological society, right? In the form where technology requires like the organization and the system pretty much then prescribes us in a way what it needs to function, as we don't want to give up all the comfort and got so used and dependent on the technology, we pretty much go with the system. Right? Surrogate activities are actions directed toward artificial goals pursued solely for the fulfillment they generate, not because the goal itself is intrinsically necessary. Science, both career advancement and political activism are all cited as examples. So, political activism, like also referring to the new left and their psychological needs, right? Yeah,
Yes.
being channeled into activism.
So here, I feel like they are very important and valid points meshed with some like real bullshit. Because like in a way he dismisses all creative work, all scientific work as surrogate activities, which are not
Yeah,
true according to some weird standard of his. He also probably has
yeah.
some kind of trauma related to math. I think his background is math.
Yeah, he's a mathematics
So
professor.
yeah, so
Yeah.
he has some problems with that because he mentioned like, well, people are made studying math, and like obviously I fully agree with some of the things he mentioned about the school, that people like kids need to have freedom, and I think that there are a lot of people in unschooling and homeschooling community who raise similar points. But his idea is almost like it's technology that makes people make kids study math, and then everything is distorted. But I think
I
creative,
mean, to make his bit stronger, though, maybe, if you look at academia and a lot of, especially those second, third grade academics, or even some nerds where you can think, okay, if they had a more fulfilling life, had to work for the basic needs, they presumably wouldn't have to write the third comment about some political scientists or something, right? So that's his definition of a surrogate activity, right? That you wouldn't miss it, you wouldn't need it if it would require considerable effort to fulfill your basic real
yeah,
needs, as he
yeah,
says,
yeah,
right? And I guess to make it strong and test the thesis, would have to think about like, I mean, at least for a couple of people in academia, if they really had, say, like more real world success and problems, presumably in this alternative life, wouldn't miss their second commentary on the commentator of Hegel they just published.
yeah. And I think he like the way he approaches it is slightly weird in terms of, so yes, when the basic needs are fulfilled according to Maslow's pyramid, as well as that, you're trying to fulfill different types of needs. So basically, like marginal utility. As soon as you are not hungry, you will look for something else to do. And obviously, there could be two paths. And he also mentions, for example, aristocrats who were engaged in hunting. Obviously, hunting was just for fun, or a different way to say it, maybe just to fight boredom. But I think his idea is like everything which is not related, or most of things which are not related to satisfying basic needs, are artificial surrogate activities. But some of the even like geeky academic work could be really engaging, and people can be in the flow. The other thing is like the whole structure of academia may be distorted, and then people need to
Yeah.
publish more because the way it's structured. So basically, there are also different and erroneous market incentives where people need to act on some signals which probably will not exist in a free market science.
But maybe there's positive things to say before pushing it away as something that's not plausible. Maybe can try to make it strong first. And I guess this basic needs talk is a bit difficult to grasp. So I guess in a way, at least you could say, well, he suggests a test for ourselves, saying, given I had proper success, or imagine basic technologies is fine, right? I mean, you run this mill and a proper farmer and have your cows, and you also have some sophistication in that process. And that's like what she says, intellectual capabilities are required. Would I then miss this activity? Would it make me unhappy if I couldn't do this thing? And says there's a lot of things we just do because we are kind of bored. And if we had something better to do, right, in a way, we wouldn't do it. And I don't know. I mean, if you look at today's society and see what people do, let's take more obvious examples like collecting stamps. I feel there's a lot of those activities that people even give up where they just, they're boring everyday job they don't care about. Just doesn't give them meaning, and they need just some activity to keep them busy so they throw themselves onto the next thing. You could have the suspicion if you actually had better things to do, right? And that would actually have some sophistication, run a small craftsman business or something. Would you then collect stamps? Would you care about it? Or would
But
you?
what if the answer is yes?
Yeah, but that's a test, right? To try to make the thesis strong and tested. I have the suspicion for collecting stamps or excessively go party every weekend that this is a symptom of not having better things to do.
And that's true because it's a simplification, but all the things you can do by coming from two different places. One could be like a neurotic place, like I'm doing this in order to avoid something else, or I'm doing it because like that's what I'm truly desire. That's kind of what my soul is asking for. For example, like
Yeah.
you can travel because you love it, or you can travel because you cannot find peace in any place. You can marry someone
Yes.
because you love them, or you can marry someone because you're scared to be alone.
So it's like acting from, I would say, a place of lack or a place of fullness. You're drawn towards something. I guess even with a cigarette, you can have that. There are like moments where actually smoking a cigarette is not an addictive move. Where it's just enjoyable, right? You have a lot of work and then you're sitting on the terrace and it just opens up your mind tobacco.
Yeah.
But of course, you really easily, at least with cigarettes, come into this addictive mode that you start craving it.
Yeah, and also often the cigarettes, like when you talk to people, why they are doing is because it's time for myself. So it's not
Yeah,
the cigarette
it's
itself, the nicotine
yeah, it's not about
itself.
the cigarette.
It's about
Taking a break
autonomy. Yeah, kind of. I
or going on the fresh air,
yes,
even.
yes, yes. So people, in a way, they what's the word? Kind of acknowledging the freedom by doing this.
Yeah, it's true. Or getting breaks at work. But maybe back to the process. So we have those stages here, right? So a goal, effort, attainment of the goal, and autonomy. And I guess the important part is this concept that we need goals that need or require us to put in considerable effort
Yeah,
to be satisfying,
yeah.
and that most people need some kind of autonomy. What do you think about those two parts? Maybe is there some
I do.
reference
Yeah,
to Erich
I, I,
Fromm or
I
something?
I
Or
do
yeah,
fully agree, and like we can use the example of stamps collecting. So people can live empty lives by not really
yeah,
doing what they're. I mean, you can think of it in a spiritual way, but not necessarily. It could be in
yeah,
like there is something we crave to do in our lives. So there are dreams, there are big dreams. Sometimes we don't allow ourselves to dream, but there are certain things that we want to do. And when we don't do them and when we distort those needs by, let's say, collect stamps, people can have empty lives. So I'm fully agree
yeah.
with that. And then like everyone who took some psychotherapy or coaching, they aware of those things that sometimes we do things not because we want them to do, but because we avoid doing something more important or maybe something which is more scarier. And I think here I'm totally agree that disruption of this power process leads to alienation, powerlessness, lack of meaning in our life. So that's basics. I'm totally agree with that.
I would suggest for now we still have 3 parts, so to go to the next section, so we can also say something overarching about the text in the end.
Mhm.
The next one would be technology cannot be reformed. Freedom is defined as the ability to exercise the power process with real goals, without interference from large organizations. Constitutional rights are dismissed as bourgeois freedom, useful instruments of the system, but not genuine autonomy. He at some point says, even like the regulation is usually more of an epiphenomenon, right? It just puts into stone what's already there in society.
Uh-huh.
The text argues that technology is a stronger social force than the desire for freedom because each individual technology appears beneficial and is willingly adopted, but the cumulative effect is a net loss of freedom. Pretty much what I tried to lay out with the automobile example earlier. The technology is irreversible. Once adopted, dependency is structural, and removal would constitute collective suicide. C. Technology threatens freedom on many fronts simultaneously, overwhelming any organized resistance. D. Technicians are intrinsically motivated to advance their work as a surrogate activity and will always outperform freedom defenders who are only trying to prevent harm. The good and bad aspects, parentheses, of technology are inseparable. Medical progress requires an entire technological ecosystem. Genetic medicine will inevitably lead to human redesign. Social agreements and laws cannot permanently constrain technology because social norms are temporary while technology persists and accumulates. And I guess about the genetic advance, he says it's even worse in a way that at some point we'd be able to choose our genes. We'll design babies or choose those babies that most fit the constraints of the technological system.
One of his points is that technology requires more mathematicians. So in a way, kids
Yeah.
would be made to study math. I'm not sure what I can agree with this point of view.
I guess it's one of many examples, right? He says the way we work now, there's so many unintended consequences, we can't foresee it. And once we adopt it and get dependent on the technology, we kind of have to live with it, right? Or unless do what he does to kind of reverse the whole process. But that is really hard. You have to do it pretty much everywhere in the world. Otherwise, there's like a temptation to readopt it, even
Uh,
if there's short term resistance, pretty much because of human nature in a way, right? And yeah, I think an interesting point was also paper regulations adopted are often epiphenomena of industry standards that are already developed, and you could say in a way because of technological requirements too. So once you have new technological requirements kind of in a office, if you have computers, you have then certain effects you kind of have to adopt to, right? To um, like efficiently work on the computer. You need to take screen breaks. That changes the office structure. That maybe changes the times of work, the setup, how we work. So in a certain way to say that those things develop from the requirements of a system and then later put into law. Presumably not a bad point, at least for those regulations, right? I don't know about general freedoms. I would be
mm,
more doubtful about that point.
yeah, but I think like he didn't talk explicitly about something related to the spontaneous order, and I think
Yeah.
the example with automobiles as well is that like even if you decide not to use it, other people using it is going to affect you because the infrastructure of the city, the whole movement of people is affected. So even if you choose not to use it, in a way, your freedom is affected, but probably positive freedom, not the negative, because people are not making you use it, but you need to move around in the city which is inhabited by cars. And but that's the result of the spontaneous order, and probably the overall thing. I'm not sure whether it's possible to generalize it like this, but I think what he draws attention to is the tension between individuals' freedom and how society imposes certain limitation on us.
Yeah, I mean, even in the next section, or talks control of human behavior and elaborates on that point a bit.
Uh-huh.
Argues that industrial society is not merely limiting freedom, but is in the process of fundamentally redesigning human nature to make it compatible with the system's requirements. It includes mass entertainment as psychological escape and stress reduction, pharmaceutical management of depression, behavior modification techniques in education, surveillance technology, propaganda through media, eventually biological and genetic manipulations. Where I wonder though, sometimes the remedy and the diagnosis seem to be put in one box, right? So, for example, taking medication for depression, even though the system maybe produces the stress, right? We now all use computers, and that is a weird human condition we put ourselves in, which we're not well adapted to, and the work environment produces stress. But then for the remedy, even though maybe pharmaceutical solution are not the best choice, he kind of pretends that this is an automatic solution. But whether we use more therapy or use this medication
Yeah.
or maybe choose to change the working conditions, that's not nothing he even considers.
Yeah, I agree. As if like we don't have agency to not take
Yeah.
antidepressants.
To everything, there's this fanatic drive. I think in which way the text is useful, that if you read things less fanatically, it can be really interesting input or framework to think in. If you have a new technology, does that need new big organizations and centralization to work properly? Or does that work in a decentralized, more small unit autonomy manner? That's a really interesting framework to think in. And also that, well, if we adopt this, are there maybe so many unintended side consequences that we end up, we become dependent and fit our new requirements to this new environment, and overall, that's maybe nothing we want to have. So I guess if we read a lot of his thing less fatalistic, more moldable,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess that is like kind of his thing, right? He was schizophrenic, he had like kind of this fatal drive, but he was also a very intelligent person, an independent thinker in a
Yeah,
way.
yeah,
So I guess all of this can be really interesting if read less
yeah.
fatalistically.
I also
Yeah.
agree that he himself sound resentful a lot. So in a way,
Yes.
his powerlessness turned out or played out in basically his terrorist activities because he didn't have capacity to use the same insights in a more productive way, engage with people
But
and
yeah,
use those ideas. And another thing is that his activities are also surrogate activities because he is not farming, but he's writing this manifesto, which also sounds like the kind of thing that he criticizes.
yeah. I mean, I don't know how strong those parents are. So first, he's hateful, but he doesn't seem to have an inferiority complex. Hard point to debate, and he doesn't seem to be over
Yeah,
socialized.
that's for sure.
So maybe even, yeah, more under socialized if you want to.
But also like it's here a lot of parallels. He's describing certain symptoms about society in the literature of humanistic existential psychologists. They basically writing about the same stuff, but also from the perspective that it can be corrected by certain psychotherapeutic intervention, by certain inner work. We can address those things and find more meaning,
Yeah,
find more purpose, find more way to act on our true desires rather than act on those kind of neurotic desires that are interjected into our psyche
yeah,
by society. So I think like what's lacking in his point of view is more productive ways to deal with the symptoms that he observed
yeah.
and decided to act on in a more violent way.
Yeah, for that, maybe let's read the last paragraph before we have a few minutes for a general
Uh,
conversation. Saying that what he does is a surrogate activity, yeah, he might agree. So what? Right? There's no doubt it would even maybe be water on the mills of his arguments, saying,
uh,
"Yeah, of course, because I'm living in such a society, right? I like can't spend my time for anything else, but that doesn't make those insights less useful. It's not really an attack, so you can just say yes. I feel you presumably wouldn't even argue that point.
but I would guess that for him it was meaningful. So in a way, his power process was kind of engaged and went
Yeah, but
through
it's not
this loop.
meaningful, right? He says you need to put in considerable effort. I mean, that's something you would have to say. He put in considerable effort for it to fulfill that role. But also that he says, well, we just do that, but doing this is presumably not as good as an activity as if you could live free of society, right? I guess that's presumably what he would say. Doing this is worse than being in a hunter-gatherer society and hunting an animal to get food. But he is not in this society, right? And he
Mm.
can't cut himself off that easily, and he wants to save the rest of society in a way, right? The text predicts two possible futures now. One in which artificial intelligence makes human labor unnecessary. That's like the hook of why I got to the text too. And a small elite controls everything. And one in which human labor remains necessary, but workers are increasingly reduced to specialized cogs. She already have in Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times also, right? In both scenarios, both human dignity and autonomy are lost. Modern humans may be happy in such a society, but they are certainly not free. They have sunk to the level of domestic animals. And the strategic revolution idea is now the text outlines two immediate tasks. First, increase social stress and instability within the industrial system to accelerate its collapse. Second, develop and propagate an anti technology ideology strong enough to prevent the system from reconstituting itself after collapse. The proposed positive ideal is nature, understood as the earth and its life forms existing independent of organized human control. Nature is preferred as an ideology because it already commands broad appeal, does not require constructing a utopian blueprint, and has quasi religious power. Revolution is said to be easier than reform because it generates stronger motivational commitment. Reform promises to self run problem, revolution promises to transform everything. And that's what he says is important because he says if you change one thing, there's like such an interconnected system that would just be fixed or changed back by the whole system. Because it's so interconnected, you would maybe slightly slow down the whole development, but wouldn't stop it. History is made by active minorities, not majorities. Revolutionary strategy should target the conflict between the technological elite and the general population, not ethnic or ideological sub-conflicts which distract and potentially advance technology. The revolution must be global and simultaneous. The text advocates using only the minimum necessary technology to fight the system, avoiding political power until the system has discredited itself in the eyes of the majority, and strikingly, having as many children as possible on the grounds that anti-technology attitudes are heritable. Okay, that is the most fanatic rabbit hole.
Mm.
I thought the most interesting point is that with greater power of AI, you can get either machines doing most of the work, right? The cyber automatization, the systems that take over control, as in some darker dystopian movies, or you have a elite that's really powerful and that manages a lot. And the elite can, of course, as well as the AI, they're both really powerful, can be benevolent or malicious, but there's a high risk if they are malicious, the world can end, which is, I guess, a common dystopian scenario
Yeah.
how things could go wrong, right?
I also thought, I'm not sure whether you read it. I think actually there are several novels by libertarian sci-fi writer Vernon Vinch, and it was basically about the kind of people who wanted to stop technological process because of the fear of the atomic war, and basically they prohibited the technology, and because they came up with some alternative technology. And it's interesting, like alternative timeline where a different alternative technologies develop. So it's very interesting way to look at potential more anarchistic way of opposing technologically advanced central government in a way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Things that I guess naturally stuck to my mind from an autonomy perspective. First, the two aspects of the left, which I think is really nice way of putting a certain psychological pattern. The other one, I guess there is a certain way you need meaningful activities that require certain effort. And that doesn't need to be necessarily basic needs, but to think about, do I just do this because I'm bored?
Yeah.
Or do I do this because it genuinely contributes to my life? And then I guess for autonomy development, there's this distinction between technology that requires big organizational structures, maybe the most important for autonomy, freedom thinking, or if it can run in this decentralized form, or maybe even promotes this decentralization.
Mhm.
Something that the book Sovereign Individual also explores how much technology allows individualism.
I think for me, what was interesting is that, and again, I see some parallels in what Kaczynski wrote to what was discussed between humanistic and behavioristic psychologists, because basically behaviorism,
Really?
and you can observe the same thing not only in behaviorist psychology but in behaviorist economics.
Yeah.
the way to engineer society to behave in a certain way, like Nudge and then Thaler approach, who recently received Nobel Prize in economics, so-called Nobel Prize in economics. I think so. In a way, like Kaczynski sounds like a kind of distorted humanist who wants human to strive and have fulfilled lives, but also he doesn't see more productive ways to achieve that, because I think
Yeah.
we all know people who strive even in the conditions of external limitations. So there's a way to believe in greatness of human dignity, in greatness of the human soul, and in human desires. Even Ayn Rand wrote about those kind of
Yeah.
architects and people who are creative, and how to find way to act on this creativity, and then also how can we oppose all the bureaucratic nuisances that stand in the way of this human creativity. And so I think in some way this manifesto is about this, like how can we allow the human spirit to reach the heights that are like there's a seed of this greatness in all of us, and like how can we allow it flourish, and probably in
Yeah.
some way technology can stand in a way.
I think something that you still have in there, and I thought a surprise, is this fanatical being super certain. What the new left also has a lot, right, in its mainstream versions about climate measures and so on. To accept all those consequences, right, you need to be super certain that you made no mistake. Because otherwise, you would just bring a lot of misery over humanity. There's this not taking it just as theory or approach to understanding something, but being so fanatically sure of this outline, especially that there's no other way, right? Just because I found some examples of this organization getting more centralized, everything is like this, not being open for other perspectives. And I think that's something that obviously is a mark of schizophrenia too, right? Becoming psychotic. People go down rabbit holes, and it's something you can definitely read here. There's actually no danger in following the whole narrative and becoming psychotic yourself or being psychotic yourself, I feel.
It's not inevitable if technology allows us to cook food or, I don't know, wash our clothes. It's not inevitable that the time that we economize by this is going to be used by boredom. It could be used for great activities.
For building free societies, for example.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, you could say that's something you maybe even cared for 5,000 years ago, right? To build your independent farm and to be left alone by the neighbors. As we have roughly 5 minutes left, maybe we can give an outlook about the practical consequence of what that means for the future, thinking especially in technological terms, for one thing, about the political development of the left and the gap in power processes of having a lot of boredom and maybe going down the path of ever escalating hedonism or perversion potentially. Do you have some thoughts about what consequences that could have for society, maybe also with a view on the AI developments of the last months? Do you think AI developments will require more centralized organizational form, or will get us by at least unintended consequences in a more power centralized structure? Or
I don't know.
does it work in small autonomous groups?
I don't know. One consequence that I assume that potentially can happen is that people choose to spend more time conversing with AI rather than with real human beings. And in
Yes.
a way, it could be a neurotic behavior, meaning that it's safe to talk to the chat rather than to talk to a stranger or even to a friend. And that
Yes.
can make us more alienated because just not being in touch with other human beings is not in our nature, but that's something that happens more and more.
But what does it mean to be in our nature? Who's right? You could say in a way, those they could just react as nice people we otherwise never meet. So
Yeah.
what if you really have a friend that's there for you and that gives you the feeling and is healing for you because you never had such a supportive conservation discussion partner?
Well, that's a huge thing because I have some thoughts about it, but I think ChatGPT cannot provide you real loving, accepting relationship.
What if you get humanoid robots that act like
That would be
people?
an interesting experiment, but I think At least for now, I don't see any kind of technology that would provide like real, genuine human to human connection, like Martin Buber's I-Thou connection.
Great. I think we covered a lot of interesting stuff, and I would invite your readers to think about where do you see those patterns of inferiority complexes and over socialization? Do you think that is dangerous? What could be unwelcome consequences in society? Second, maybe check for yourself things you do. Do you do them because you're bored and have nothing better to do, or would you generally still want to do those things even if you had better things to do? Guess it's a good thing to for everyone to check for themselves. And third, what do you think, especially with the new AI developments? Do we move more towards centralization of power? Do those technologies that we introduce require more organization, or do they allow us more autonomy in small units? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, what comes up for me is have fun. I think the more fun we have, the easier it's going to be on with every kind of endeavor that we engage in.
Yeah, it's almost a hedonistic end. And I'm talking from Berlin, so who would know it better?
Serious note, I think like if we
Yes.
in some way engage in our own personal growth, that's basically our antidote to over socialization. Because by growing ourselves, we become better for ourselves, but also for others as well.
Those discussions hopefully help becoming more aware of oneself and
Yeah.
how one is placed in society and related to technology. But I guess, yeah, the fun comment is I still like it. I think playfulness is really important, especially after having such a serious, fatalistic, dark text.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, just be lighthearted and playful in the way you approach everything.
So I guess
Great.
that's it for today. Thanks for staying with us and let us know what you think about this podcast.
Also, thank you from me, and also thank you, Alex, for having this discussion with me. I found it really insightful and refreshing going through this text with you today.
Pleasure as always.
Thank you. Till next time, hopefully. Bye.
Bye.